March of 1972, 7 men entered a ridgeline sector of Quang Province. 4 came out. The ones who came out heard, on the last night, a low, wet clicking sound moving away from them through the canopy, back toward the man they had left behind, and then going quiet before dawn. That sound has not gone quiet for me. My name is Raymond Calloway. I hold the rank of Specialist, 4th Class, United States Army, serial number 67-441-3892, currently assigned to the 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division, on medical administrative hold at Phu Bai Combat Base, Quang Tri Province, Republic of Vietnam. I am giving this statement voluntarily, under oath, to Captain Gerald Hess of the Judge Advocate General Corps and to Mr. Frederick Ansel, civilian liaison attached to the Defense Intelligence Agency, on this date of April 19, 1972. The events I am describing took place between March 11th and March 15th of this year, 23 days ago as of this morning. I want to be clear about what this deposition is and is not. It is not a request for medical evaluation. It is not a claim that I was incapacitated or confused in the field. I have been asked by Captain Hess to give a complete and sequential account of what my unit encountered in Grid Sector Whiskey Tango 7, on the ridge trail designated Route Blue on our operational maps, during a 4-night reconnaissance tasking. I am going to do that. I ask only that I be allowed to give it in the order it happened, because the order matters. Things that seemed unrelated in the first 2 days became part of the same thing by the 4th. If I skip to the end, you will not understand why the sergeant did what he did, or why I did what I did, or why Doucet is not sitting in this room giving his own statement. I am 24 years old. I have been in country 11 months. I am not a man who frightens easily, and I ask that the record reflect that my file will show no prior psychological evaluation, no disciplinary actions, and a commendation for the action at Firebase Nancy in September of last year. I tell you this not to establish my credibility so much as to establish what kind of man I was before March of this year, because I am not entirely that man anymore, and the difference between who I was and who I am now has a specific cause, and that cause is what I am here to describe. The unit was constituted on March 10, 1972, assembled for a 5-night reconnaissance patrol to an area along the western karst ridge in Quang Tri. The specific tasking was to surveil a trail junction the S2 shop believed was being used for resupply movement by NVA forces pushing east ahead of the Easter offensive buildup. We were to document traffic volume, direction, and any infrastructure evidence along a 2-kilometer stretch of ridgeline, report grid coordinates, and extract on the evening of March 15th. 7 men. I will give you the names of the ones who matter to the account, and I will account for the ones the record needs to account for. Sergeant 1st Class Donald Marsh was our team leader. He was 31, a lifer in the way that means he had stopped imagining any life outside the Army. He had 2 previous tours in Vietnam, one in the Delta and one in IT Corps, and he ran a patrol the way some men run a machine shop, efficiently, without sentiment, with a clear picture of what the output was supposed to look like. He was not a cruel man. He was a certain man, and in the jungle, certainty is usually an asset. I need you to understand that about Marsh before I describe how he behaved in the final days, because what he did was not stupidity and it was not cowardice. It was certainty, meeting something that certainty had no category for, and taking longer than it should have to adjust. Corporal Louis Thibault was our senior enlisted after Marsh, and he was from a small town in the Atchafalaya Basin in Louisiana, which he mentioned often enough that it became a kind of verbal tic, this constant mild assertion that he was from somewhere specific and intended to return to it. He was 26, compact and deliberate, and he had a habit when he was thinking hard of pressing his thumbnail into the pad of his index finger, over and over, just pressing and releasing, which I noticed because I stood next to him a great deal on that operation, and by the end, I was watching his hands more than I was watching the canopy. Thibault is relevant to this account in a way that will become clear, And I will come back to what he found on the second night when we reached the tunnel entrance, because that is the moment this thing changed from a strange patrol into something I am still trying to name. Specialist Thomas Cruz ran the radio. He was from Ohio, 23, quiet in the way of men who have decided that most conversation is not worth the energy. He had good ears, which matters for what I am going to describe. There were 3 other enlisted men in the unit, whose names I will provide to the record, but who do not require the same level of description. Privates Alderman, Okafor, and Briggs. They were all 19 or 20. They all functioned well for the first 2 days. And there was Doucette. Private First Class Marcus Doucette was 22, from Shreveport, Louisiana, and he had been in country 4 months when this patrol went out. He was our point man, which is a position that goes to either the best or the most eager, and with Doucette, it was both. He had a quality that is hard to describe precisely, but that every experienced soldier recognizes. He moved through the jungle as if the jungle had agreed to let him pass. Quiet in a way that was not trained, that seemed constitutional. He had dark eyes that were always moving, and he rarely said anything dramatic or memorable, which meant that when he did speak, you paid attention. He told me the morning we saddled up that the sector we were going into felt wrong to him. And when I asked what he meant by wrong, he said he did not know exactly, that he had talked to a Kit Carson scout attached to another unit who had been in those hills, and the scout had been reluctant to say much. And what he did say was in Vietnamese that Doucette did not speak well enough to pass. That conversation is the last piece of information I want you to carry into the account, because I will come back to it. Doucette told me something else on the 3rd night that I believe the record needs. I will get to it when I get to it. We inserted by helicopter on the afternoon of March 10, landing in a clearing approximately 3 kilometers south of the ridge trail we were tasked to surveil, and we moved to our first night position without incident. The jungle in that sector of Quang Tri is dense secondary growth over karst limestone formations, which means the ground underneath you is not continuous. It is full of voids, sinkholes, cave entrances partially obscured by root systems, places where the soil has collapsed over an empty space below. The limestone ridges in that area had been worked by NVA engineers for years, tunneled and chambered in ways our maps only partially reflected, and the S2 briefing had specifically noted that we might encounter previously undocumented tunnel infrastructure. We had been told to grid reference any such findings and move on. We were not equipped for tunnel exploration. The first night was quiet in the way that a patrol's first night is always quiet, meaning quiet enough that every sound becomes something to interpret. The jungle at night in Vietnam is not silent. It is a continuous noise environment, insects and frogs and the movement of animals and the wind in the canopy and rain when it comes. And you learn to read it the way you learn to read a face, not by the presence of expression, but by the presence of the wrong expression. On the first night I noted nothing wrong. The sounds were what they should have been. I took my watch from 0200 to 0400, and the jungle spoke in all its ordinary registers, and I logged nothing in my field notes. It was on the morning of the second day that the animals changed. We moved at first light toward the ridge trail, covering roughly 2 kilometers of uphill terrain through increasingly dense growth. I was third in the column, behind Doucette on point and Marsh directly ahead of me, and I remember that we had been moving for perhaps 40 minutes when I became aware that the birds had gone quiet. Not gradually, the way birds quiet when a patrol moves through and then resume as you pass. All at once, as if something had given a signal, the insect noise continued. The frogs near a creek drainage we were crossing continued. But the birds, which had been a constant layer above everything else, simply stopped, and the silence they left behind had a different texture than the silence before dawn. It had weight. Doucette stopped without a hand signal. He just stopped, and Marsh almost walked into him, and I watched Doucette stand there in the creek drainage with water around his boots and his head tilted back, looking up into the canopy, and I looked up too. The canopy at that point was perhaps 60 feet above us, a continuous dense layer with gaps where the limestone pushed through and where older trees had fallen. I saw nothing in the canopy. I heard nothing that I could identify as specific. But Duce stood there for what felt like nearly a full minute before Marsh put a hand on his shoulder and moved him forward. I noted the bird's silence in my field log at 06:43. I noted that it lasted approximately 4 minutes before gradually resuming. I noted that Duce had reacted to it before any of the rest of us, and that he had looked specifically at the canopy rather than the undergrowth, which is where most threats in that environment present themselves. I did not know what to make of that at the time. I write it down because it is a piece that belongs in the sequence. We reached the ridge trail by mid-morning and established our observation position in a natural depression on the north side of the trail, with good sight lines in both directions and adequate overhead cover from a stand of bamboo. The trail itself was a path approximately 1.5 meters wide, worn down to bare earth by foot traffic, with the characteristic smoothing of regular use. We observed it for the remainder of the day. Between 1100 and 1800 hours, we logged 2 groups of NVA soldiers moving east. The first group numbering approximately 12 men, with a weapons load suggesting an infantry unit on the move. The second group of 4 men carrying what appeared to be communications equipment. Crews raised the firebase on the radio at 1400 and reported the traffic to S2, received acknowledgement, and was told to continue observation. Standard, unremarkable. The kind of day a reconnaissance unit has 100 times. At approximately 1600 hours, Okafor tapped my arm and pointed down the trail to the west. There was an animal on the trail, a monkey, a large one, which was not in itself unusual except that it was sitting in the middle of the trail in full daylight, motionless, and it was looking in our direction, not the unfocused look of an animal that has registered a disturbance and is trying to locate it. A direct, fixed look, the kind a man gives you when he is deciding something. It sat there for perhaps 3 minutes. Then it left, not hurrying, simply moving back into the undergrowth, as if it had finished what it came to do. Marsh said nothing about it. I noted it in my log and said nothing either. Doucet, who was positioned 6 meters down the line from me, had his eyes on the canopy above the point where the monkey had come from. We established our night position at 1830, pulling back 50 meters from the trail into a denser section of growth, and that was when Marsh told us we would be spending part of the next day mapping a secondary ridgeline to our northeast, where the S2 had noted a possible tunnel entrance on aerial imagery. He showed us the photograph, a grainy black and white print showing what appeared to be a dark oval in the limestone face, partially screened by vegetation. He wanted grid coordinates and a ground-level description. It was additional tasking beyond what we had originally been briefed, and Douce, who was sitting on my right, pressed the heel of his boot into the mud without looking at Marsh, and said nothing. I took second watch that night, from 2200 to midnight. The jungle was loud in the usual way for the first hour. Then, at approximately 23:15, I heard something that I am going to describe to you as precisely as I am able, and I ask that you bear with the specificity, because the sound is the central fact of everything that followed, and I need you to understand exactly what it was. It was a clicking sound. That is the word for it, and also an insufficient word for it. The way that calling a bullet a small, fast object is accurate, but incomplete. It was a series of rapid, hard clicks in close succession, perhaps 5 or 6 in a row, with a brief pause, and then another series of 5 or 6, and then a pause slightly longer, and then the sequence again. The rhythm was not mechanical. It was not the rhythm of an insect, which has a regularity that the ear learns to assign to background. It was the rhythm of something that was varying its own rhythm deliberately, the way a man tapping a surface with his finger is not a metronome, but a consciousness. Each cluster of clicks was separated from the next by a pause of slightly different length, which meant you could not habituate to it, could not let it sink into the background noise the way you do with frogs or wind. Every time it paused, you waited for it to resume, and every time it resumed, the place it came from had shifted slightly. It was coming from the jungle's edge to the east of our position. That is where I first located it. I put the sound at perhaps 60 to 80 meters away. I woke Marsh without a word and pointed. He listened for nearly 2 minutes without speaking. The clicking continued. spacing itself, shifting, and then after perhaps 10 minutes it stopped entirely and did not resume during my watch, or during the watch that followed. Marsh logged it as probable animal vocalization and did not enter it as a significant finding in the operation report. I noted it in my own field log with a question mark beside the description. Crews, who had the 0400 watch, heard nothing unusual. In the morning, nobody spoke about it directly, which is its own kind of acknowledgement. The second day on the ridge was when we found the tunnel entrance, and that is when Thibault found what he found. And I want to be careful about how I present this to the record, because I know how it will read. We moved to the secondary ridgeline in the morning, a 40-minute climb through ground that was increasingly broken by the karst formations, limestone ribs pushing up through the soil at angles that forced us to detour constantly. The vegetation changed quality as we climbed, darker and denser, the canopy thicker, the undergrowth less, which is characteristic of old-growth limestone forest in that area. The light was different too, more filtered, more green. I noticed the temperature dropped as we moved into the shadow of the ridge, which would have been unremarkable, except that the drop felt more pronounced than the elevation change accounted for. Doucette found the tunnel entrance at approximately 1,000 hours. It was set into a vertical face of limestone, partially collapsed, the opening approximately 1.5 meters wide and perhaps 90 centimeters tall, framed by the roots of a large tree that had grown over the rock face and sent roots down into the gap. The mud around the entrance was black and wet, despite the fact that there had been no rain the previous day, and the air coming from the opening was markedly colder than the air outside it, with a smell that I will describe for the record as old and mineral, with something beneath it that was organic in a way that did not correspond to any smell I could assign to a category. Not rot exactly, not earth exactly, something between the two that I have not smelled before or since. Marsh crouched at the entrance and looked in with his flashlight. He reported what appeared to be a hand-cut tunnel descending at a shallow angle, with shoring at irregular intervals, consistent with NVA construction, but older-looking than the tunnels we had encountered elsewhere. He wanted to probe the entrance to a depth of 3 meters to confirm construction type. He sent in Thibault, who was the smallest man in the unit after Doucet, with a flashlight and a probe rod. Thibault was in the entrance for approximately 8 minutes. When he came back out, he was carrying something. He did not hold it out to show us. He was looking at it himself, rotating it in his fingers, and his expression was the expression of a man trying to fit a thing he is looking at into a description that will not accommodate it. He held it out to Marsh. Marsh looked at it for a long moment. Then Marsh handed it to me. It was a molar. I can say that with certainty, because I can recognize a molar. The crown, the ridged occlusal surface, the roots. It was undeniably a molar tooth. It was nearly 3 inches long from crown to root tip, which no human molar approaches, and which no primate molar I have seen approaches either. The crown was approximately the right shape for a human molar, not elongated or narrowed, not the right shape for a herbivore or a carnivore with specialized dentition. The shape was human, the scale was not, and the roots, when I turned it over, curved inward at their tips, in a way that I found difficult to look at for reasons I cannot fully articulate, as if the shape was almost correct, but had made a wrong decision at the last moment. Thibault said he had pulled it from the mud wall inside the entrance, perhaps 1.5 meters in, where it was embedded in compacted soil alongside what appeared to be fragments of bone that he had not been able to extract. Marsh said it was probably a pig tooth. He took it from me and turned it over twice and said probably a wild pig. The roots do that on pig molars sometimes. And he handed it back to Thibault and told us to grid the entrance and move. Thibault put the tooth in his breast pocket. I watched him press his thumbnail into the pad of his index finger twice before he zipped the pocket closed. I noted the tooth in my field log with the dimensions I have given you and the description I have given you. I noted the bone fragments that Thibault had described. I noted the smell and the cold air, and I noted that the mud at the tunnel entrance was wet and black, and that I could not determine a source for the moisture. I note for the record that I am not a zoologist, and I make no claim to expertise in the dentition of wild pigs, or any other animal. I note also that I have seen a great many wild pigs in 11 months in Vietnam, and I have never seen a tooth that looked like what Thibault pulled from that wall. We moved back to the ridge trail by early afternoon and resumed observation. Traffic was lighter than the previous day, one group of 6 men moving west in the early afternoon, which crews relayed to the firebase. Marsh seemed satisfied with the day's work, and his mood was what I would describe as professionally content, which was his baseline. The rest of the unit was quieter than usual. Okafor and Briggs were sitting together and not talking, which was unusual for them. Alderman was cleaning his rifle with the concentration of a man who needs something to do with his hands. Doucet was watching the canopy. He had been doing it all day, at intervals, and by late afternoon I had started watching it myself, without quite deciding to. The canopy above and around our position was predominantly bamboo and broadleaf hardwoods, with the bamboo dominant on the ridge proper, and the hardwoods increasing as you moved down the slopes. The hardwood branches were heavy and complex, the kind of branching structure that produces deep shadow even in daylight, and that in the late afternoon light produced shadows that moved constantly as the canopy shifted in the wind. I am saying this because what I am about to describe needs to be understood in that visual context. At approximately 16:30, in the canopy above the western approach to our position, I saw something that I am going to describe without hedging and without speculation. I saw a shape that was pale against the shadowed canopy. Pale, meaning lighter in color than the bark and the shadow and the green of the growth around it. Lighter in the way of skin, rather than the lighter of dried wood or exposed limestone. The shape was on a large branch, and it was 4-limbed, and all 4 limbs were in contact with the branch. It was not standing. It was crouched or flattened against the branch in the manner of an animal, not hanging below it. The branch was perhaps 20 meters above the ground, and perhaps 40 meters from our position, and the light was falling and shifting, and I cannot give you a complete description of the shape. What I can give you is the shoulder width, because that was the thing that registered and did not let go. The distance between the shoulder points of that shape was wrong, too wide. Not wrong in the way of a misidentified object, not the kind of wrong you recalibrate when the light changes. Wrong in a way that your body registers before your mind catches up, the way a spider is wrong, the way something is wrong when the proportions are right, but the scale has been altered in a direction it should not go. I looked at it for approximately 5 seconds. Then Doucet, who had been watching the same section of canopy, put his hand on my arm. I looked at him. When I looked back, the shape was gone. I did not report this to Marsh immediately. I told Doucet what I had seen, and he told me he had been tracking the same shape intermittently for the previous 2 hours, losing it and relocating it, and he believed it had moved at least 3 times in those 2 hours, always keeping the same general distance from our position, always in the high canopy. He said it moved on 4 limbs and was much faster than the branches it moved through should have permitted, passing between them without the large-scale swaying you would expect from something of that size. Marsh, when I told him, took it seriously enough to put Alderman and Okafor on specific canopy watch for the next hour. Neither reported a sighting. At last, Light Marsh logged my sighting as possible long-armed primate, gibbon population active in ridge canopies, unconfirmed. He was not dismissive when he said it. He was reaching for the closest available category, which is what a sergeant does, because a sergeant who tells his men he cannot explain what they saw has introduced a variable he cannot control. The second night. We established the night position at 18:30. We had a small perimeter, 6 meters across roughly, 7 men in a circle with fields of fire outward, which is standard for a unit of our size doing overnight in Indian country. Marsh assigned watches in pairs for the first part of the night, and single watches after midnight, which he sometimes adjusted based on the threat assessment. The night was overcast, no moon visible, which made the darkness under the canopy nearly absolute. We had no lights. I took the 2000 to 2200 watch with Briggs, and for the first hour it was quiet, the ordinary jungle night quiet that I have described. Then, at approximately 211:10, the clicking began. It was the same sound I had heard the previous night. The same clustering rhythm, the same variability of pause. But it was louder. Not dramatically louder, not the difference between a distant sound and a near one, but enough louder that I was immediately certain it was closer than it had been the night before. The previous night I had estimated 60 to 80 meters. This night I would estimate 40 to 50 meters, coming from the east again, but also, within a few minutes, from a second position to the north, a second source of the same sound that began while the eastern clicking was still active, so that for a period of perhaps 4 minutes, I was hearing two separate sequences of clicking, slightly out of phase with each other. The sound was in the canopy. I need to be certain this is understood. It was not ground level. It was not coming from the undergrowth. I oriented to it several times during that watch, and each time I located it overhead, in the branches above and around the perimeter. The eastern source was at approximately the height of the lower canopy, perhaps 15 to 20 meters. The northern source seemed higher, 30 meters or more. I woke Marsh. I woke Cruz. All three of us spent 40 minutes listening to the clicking move around the perimeter's edge, never coming closer than the canopy, never descending, but moving, cycling through positions, east to northwest to south, and back to east. A slow circuit completed in approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and then repeated. The circuit was irregular enough that it was not mechanical, not the repetition of a recorded loop, but it was too regular to be random animal movement. It had the quality of a patrol. At 23:40 it stopped entirely, not gradually, not fading with distance, stopped. Marsh called a full unit stand-to for the next 2 hours, meaning no one slept, everyone on perimeter, weapons ready. Nothing happened. Nothing approached. The jungle sounds resumed their ordinary baseline. At 0200, he released us to normal watch rotation, and the rest of the night was quiet. In the morning, Marsh held what he called a quick debrief standing in the night position, meaning he asked what we had heard and recorded the answers in his field notebook. Everyone in the unit had heard the clicking during the circuit phase. Even the men who had been off watch and technically asleep reported that the sound had woken them. Marsh noted this in his field book. He also noted it in the operations log he was keeping, which is one of the documents you have in front of you, Captain Hess, and which will reflect that his description of the sound is consistent with what I am giving you now. This is the moment I want the record to mark, because after the debrief, Doucet came to me, and he said this: it was counting us. I asked him what he meant by that. He said that the circuit pattern, the stops, the pauses, the way the sound lingered longest at the positions where a single man was standing alone, the way it had tracked through each occupied point of the perimeter before moving on, he believed it was not patrolling. He believed it was taking inventory. He had timed the pauses on his watch and told me that the longest pauses corresponded exactly to the positions occupied by single men, and the shortest pauses corresponded to positions occupied by two. He had been doing this during the night without telling anyone, lying still with his watch and his field notebook, and by the time he told me he had sketched the pattern twice to make sure he was reading it correctly. I believed him. I will tell you why. Because the pauses were longest at my position, and I had been alone on my watch for the full 2 hours, and I remember the feeling during those pauses of something staying on me, of being the subject of attention in a way that the darkness itself seemed to confirm, a density to the direction the sound was coming from, that I cannot explain in physical terms, and would not try to explain to a panel of sober military investigators, except to say that I have been under observation by enemy forces on previous operations, and I know what that feeling is, and this was that feeling, and it was coming from 40 feet above my head. I told Marsh what Doucet had said. Marsh listened to the whole thing. His face did not change. He asked Doucet if he was willing to put his name on that assessment in a report. Doucet said yes. Marsh said he would note it, and that in the meantime we had a tasking to complete, and we would complete it. He was not angry. He was not dismissive, the way an officer dismisses enlisted men to maintain authority. He was assessing, and his assessment was that the mission came first, that we had good intelligence value from this sector, and that the S2 would need 2 more nights of trail observation to have a solid traffic pattern for the planning staff. I want the record to reflect that I do not believe Marsh was wrong to hold the position at that point. The clicking had not resulted in any contact. We had seen a shape in the canopy that could not be definitively identified. Doucet's analysis of the patrol pattern was intelligent and alarming, but it was also the kind of reading that a tired man in a stressful environment can impose on ambiguous data. I was not certain Doucet was wrong. I am also not certain Marsh was wrong to weigh it the way he did. What I am certain of is that by the end of the 3rd day, the weight had shifted. The 3rd day began with birds. This was notable because the birds had been absent the previous morning and the morning before that, beginning from the time we entered the ridgeline sector, and their return felt wrong, in the same way that their absence had felt wrong. Not wrong like a trap, wrong like a message in a language you understand the tone of, without understanding the words. The birds were back, and they were loud, almost performatively loud, and Doucet watched them and said nothing, and Thibault pressed his thumbnail into his finger, and Marsh checked his map and sent Doucet forward, on point toward the trail. We spent the morning on trail observation and logged moderate NVA traffic, nothing dramatic, which crews relayed to the firebase. At approximately 1300 Marsh sent Thibault and Alderman on a 50-meter sweep south of our position to check a secondary track the aerial imagery had flagged, and they came back 40 minutes later with news that the track showed signs of recent heavy use, boot prints and drag marks consistent with supply movement, and Marsh wanted to extend our observation to cover that secondary track the following day. It was Thibault who noticed what was on the ground around our night position. He described it to Marsh and to me, and then he showed us, and I am going to describe what he showed us. At 6 separate points around the perimeter of our previous night's position, approximately 2 to 3 meters outside the circle of our fighting positions, there were marks in the earth. Not footprints in the usual sense, impressions. 3-point impressions, each approximately 60 centimeters in length, spaced in a way that did not correspond to a bipedal stride or a quadrupedal gait I am familiar with. The spacing between successive impressions was irregular in a way that suggested variable speed rather than uniform movement. The depth of impression was significant, deeper than my own boot prints in the same soil, which suggested a weight I estimated at well above 200 pounds per impression point. Some of the impressions at the northernmost point of the circuit were directly above the position I had occupied during my watch, between the roots of a large hardwood that provided my overhead cover. That is not the hardest part. The hardest part is that the impressions were inside the root structure of the tree, not on the ground beside the tree, among the roots, at the base of the trunk, pressed down into the gap between exposed root flanges, as if the thing that made them had been crouched there for a period of time, crouched in the space 2 feet above the back of my head. I will give the record a moment to absorb that. Marsh measured the impressions with the probe rod. He photographed them with the camera from the operations kit, a small Minox unit, and the film from that camera was submitted with the original deposition, and I am told has been developed and will be attached to the evidentiary record. He said nothing while he was doing this. When he was done, he straightened up and looked at Thibault, and then at me, and his face was the face of a man revising a calculation without wanting anyone to see him do it. He did not order withdrawal. What he did was modify the night position plan for that evening, tighter perimeter, pairs on watch for the entire night, rather than splitting into singles, and crews to maintain a live radio link to the firebase at 30-minute check-in intervals throughout the night. He told Okafor and Briggs to cut stakes from bamboo and set them in an outer ring 10 meters from the perimeter as an early detection measure. This is a standard technique, and I do not fault it. I note it because it tells you how Marsh was now thinking about the threat, as a ground threat, something that approached on foot through the undergrowth. He was still operating within the categories he had available. I spoke to Doucet in the late afternoon, while Okafor and Briggs were cutting stakes. I told him about the impressions at the base of the tree above my position. He listened and did not look surprised, and that absence of surprise was its own information. I asked him directly what he thought was out there, and he said that he did not know what to call it, but that he was sure of two things. It was not one of them, and it wanted something from us specifically, not from any group of soldiers in any part of the jungle, but from us. This group. Here. Now. And he thought it might be connected to the tunnel entrance. I asked him why the tunnel. He reached over and touched the pocket on Thibaut's flak vest, the one where Thibaut had put the tooth, and then he pulled his hand back and said he thought we had taken something that we should not have taken. I thought about this for the rest of the afternoon, and I thought about it on my watch that night, and I did not reach a firm conclusion, and I want the record to reflect that I did not reach a firm conclusion because I did not want to. I had been in country long enough to be superstitious in the operational sense, meaning I took the non-quantifiable seriously enough to factor it into my risk assessments. But there is a difference between operational superstition and telling your sergeant that you think a large unknown creature is tracking your unit through the canopy because your corporal took a tooth from a tunnel wall. I was not ready to say that. Not yet. The third night. The clicking began at 1940, while there was still grey light visible through the canopy. It had not begun before dark on either of the previous nights. Marsh was still checking the perimeter positions when it started, and I saw him stop and stand still and listen, and then continue moving without a word. It was louder. I do not mean marginally louder, the incremental change between the first and second nights. This was substantially louder, close enough that I found myself straining against the impulse to move backward, to create distance between myself and the direction it was coming from, which was directly above me. Not 40 or 50 meters to the east. Directly above my position. When I looked up, I saw only the dark of the canopy and the slightly lighter dark of the sky visible in the gaps, and I heard the clicking at a distance I estimated as no more than 15 to 20 meters above my head. The circuit that night was shorter. It had taken 30 to 40 minutes to complete a full circuit on the second night. This time it was 15 to 20 minutes, which meant either there was more than one source or the source was moving faster. I believed it was more than one source because on two separate occasions during the circuit, I heard clicking from opposite sides of the perimeter simultaneously, brief overlap of perhaps 30 seconds, before one of the two sources went quiet and the other continued. Thibaut was on watch on the south side of the perimeter, and I was on the north, and at approximately 21:30, he crawled across the perimeter to me, and pressed his lips close to my ear and said, "Calloway, it's above the foxholes." He was right. It was directly above the foxholes, moving position to position in the canopy with that speed I had noted from Doucet's report of the previous afternoon, the speed that passed through the branches without the displacement you would expect. I could not see anything. I could hear it, the clusters of clicks above each occupied position, the pause, the movement to the next position. Click cluster, pause, movement, unhurried, systematic. At approximately 2200, I left my position and went to Marsh, moving low and slow. I told him in a flat voice, as close to the voice of a situation report as I could manage, that I wanted to request a withdrawal to the extraction point. I told him what I was hearing and where it was coming from. He already knew where it was coming from. He had been listening to it for 2 hours. He looked at me for a long moment and then told me we were staying, that we had one more night of tasking remaining, and that command needed the data, and that whatever was in the canopy was in the canopy, meaning not on the ground, meaning as long as it stayed in the canopy, we were not in contact, and he was not going to pull a recon team off a valid tasking because of animal noise. I want to be honest with you about this moment. There is a version of this account where I argue that Marsh was obviously wrong and I was obviously right, and the record should condemn his decision. I do not believe that is fully honest. I know what the mission was. I know what the S2 needed. I know what it costs a sergeant to abandon a valid tasking because his men are frightened of a sound in the trees. I think Marsh made the call a sergeant in his position was almost required to make, and I think he was wrong to make it. And I think both of those things are true at the same time, and I ask that the record hold that complexity rather than resolve it in my favor after the fact. What I also did not do at that moment was mention Doucet's theory about the tooth. I could have. I had been thinking about it all afternoon and all evening. I had decided, somewhere between late afternoon and the moment I crawled to Marsh's position, that I did not know how to say it in terms that would change his calculation. So I did not say it. That decision is part of this account. The clicking continued through the night. The unit did not sleep. Okafor at one point moved his body against the base of a tree and put his rifle to his shoulder and aimed upward and held that position for an hour, without firing and without anything coming into his sights. Briggs, I was told later, was quietly reciting something under his breath for the last 3 hours of the night, and Cruz told me afterward that he thought it was a prayer, and that Briggs had kept his hand on the radio handset the whole time, not transmitting, just holding it. By dawn, the clicking had stopped. We had logged it for approximately 9 hours, with no more than 2 or 3 gaps of more than 15 minutes. Everyone in the unit was red-eyed and slow, running on the particular energy of extreme sleeplessness and sustained fear, which is a kind of energy that performs well for a short time and then fails catastrophically. That morning, Marsh told us we had one more night. Doucet came to me then, and what he said was, "Sergeant Marsh is going to get someone killed." I did not tell Marsh that Doucet had said this. I should tell you that too, for the record. I asked Doucet what he wanted to do, and he said he wanted to pull Thibault aside and have Thibault leave the tooth at the tunnel entrance, because he believed it was the tooth, and he believed the tunnel entrance was where it should go. I asked him how he proposed to convince Marsh to allow a 2-man movement to the tunnel and back, and he said he did not propose to ask permission. He said he would tell Marsh he needed to check the secondary track for updated sign, which was plausible enough that Marsh would likely approve it. I told him I would think about it. I did not tell him quickly enough. Marsh used the morning hours to draft an updated situation report and have Cruz transmit it to the firebase, and the firebase came back with a message that the S2 wanted a 4th night of observation on the secondary track, meaning our timeline had just extended. And Marsh gathered us to deliver this information, and when he was done, Doucet said, in a voice that the rest of the unit could hear, "Sergeant, I need to take Thibault and make a run back to the tunnel entrance." Marsh asked why. Doucet told him about the tooth. He told him plainly and directly, not dramatically, in the flat way that Doucet said everything, that he believed the tooth was the reason for the activity in the canopy, that he believed returning it would reduce or eliminate the threat to the unit, and that he wanted permission to take Thibault to the tunnel entrance and back in under 2 hours. The unit was very quiet while he said this. Marsh looked at Thibault. Thibault had his hand flat against the outside of his breast pocket, without seeming to notice he was doing it. Marsh said, "That is not a legitimate military assessment, and I am not approving a movement based on it." Doucet said, "Then I am asking you to authorize the movement as a secondary track check, and I will deal with the tunnel when we get there." Marsh said no. He said it once, clearly, and that was the end of it, and Doucet did not push further, because Doucet was not the kind of man who pushed past no when it was his commanding officer's no. But here is the thing I need you to understand about that moment. The argument between Doucet and Marsh was audible to the full unit, and from that point forward, the unit was not a unit in the cohesive sense. It was Marsh's side and the other side, not dramatically, not mutinously, but in the way that men who agree with each other begin to orient toward each other and away from the man who made the wrong call. By mid-afternoon you could see it in where people sat and whom people looked at before moving. The 4th day was long and quiet in a way that felt like holding your breath. We observed the trail. Traffic was light. Marsh had us split to cover both the main trail and the secondary track, meaning our perimeter at night would have to cover more ground with the same number of men, which reduced our depth. I noted this in my field log, and did not say it to Marsh because there was no point. Crews raised the firebase at the standard check-in intervals and the responses were routine. The jungle around us had returned to bird noise during the day, that same performative loudness I had noted on the 3rd morning. And now I understood the loudness differently, the way you understand a detail in a photograph differently, after you know what the photograph was taken of. At approximately 1400 hours, I looked up from the trail and found Doucet beside me. He pointed southeast, up the ridge slope from our position, toward the tree line above the karst formation. Something pale, higher and closer than the sighting on the second afternoon, the canopy thinner at that angle, better light. I had perhaps 8 to 10 seconds before it moved, and in those 8 to 10 seconds I want to tell you what I saw. The shape was in the upper canopy, 40 meters above the ground, moving between two large hardwoods. It was moving on all four limbs across the branch surface, not swinging beneath, not standing upright, across, like a very large spider moves across a surface, but with the limb arrangement of something bilateral. The arms were long, the legs were long, the body between them was thick-trunked and hunched. The skin, and I am calling it skin because it was not fur, and it was not bark, and it was not cloth. The skin was pale, in a way that did not make sense in a canopy environment. Pale in the way of something that lives in the dark and does not need camouflage, because nothing hunts it. The head was down, angled toward the ground, toward us, and the head was large and approximately the right shape for a primate, except too large, the same scalar wrongness as the shoulder width, and it was looking at us. I am certain it was looking at us. I cannot give you a description of the eyes because, at 40 meters in that light, I could not resolve the features. What I can tell you is that the head was oriented toward us, and it was not moving. It was holding position with the rest of the body in motion, the body flowing between branches with that water-fast speed, while the head remained fixed in our direction. And then the head turned, and the rest of the body turned with it, and it was gone into the canopy. I looked at Doucet. Doucet said nothing. He picked up his rifle and held it, not aiming it, just holding it the way you hold something when you need something in your hands. I told Marsh what I had seen. Marsh logged it. He put it in the field book as large primate, possible gibbon, possible macaque variant, possible unknown. He wrote the words possible unknown in his field book on the afternoon of March 14th, 1972. And if you have that field book in evidence, Captain Hess, I expect that entry is there. Marsh was a precise man, and he did not leave things out of his field book. He noted what he had a category for, and he noted what he did not, and he kept moving. At the close of the fourth day, Marsh confirmed we would hold one more night. The firebase had confirmed the additional tasking, and the extraction would proceed as scheduled the following evening, March 15th. One more night. I want to tell you about the evening before the fourth night, because there is something in it that belongs to the record, even though nothing external happened during those hours. The Unit 8, we had our rations in the way of soldiers on a long patrol, joylessly and efficiently, and then we prepared the night position, and the sun went down, and the birds went quiet as they always did with the dark, and we waited. Thibault sat next to me for a while, before he went to his position. He had the tooth out of his pocket and was turning it in his hands in the last light, and I looked at it again, the curve of those roots, the scale of it, the almost rightness of the crown that was somehow worse than if it had been wholly alien, and I asked him what he was going to do with it. He said he was going to keep it, that whatever Doucet believed about it, he had found it in a tunnel, and he had followed legal military procedure in recording and retaining it as a potential intelligence item, which was true, and that he was not going to throw away a piece of physical evidence because of a theory. He said it in a way that sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as me, and I noted the thumbnail against the fingertip and did not push him further. He put the tooth back in his pocket and zipped it closed. That was the last time I saw Thibault before the fourth night began. I want to be as precise as I can about the sequence of events on the fourth night, because this is the night that the deposition is ultimately about, and because the events are important, and I have gone over them 100 times in the 23 days since they happened, and I am confident in the sequence, even where I am not confident in my interpretations. The clicking began at 1850, before full dark, for the second consecutive night, starting while light remained in the canopy. It was lower than it had ever been. Previous nights I had estimated 15 to 20 meters minimum for the canopy sounds. That evening I estimated between 8 and 12 meters, barely above the treetops. Close enough that the clicks had individual character, close enough that I could hear, or believed I could hear, the wet quality to the sound that I described at the beginning of this statement, the quality of something organic and moist, like a knuckle joint being worked, but amplified and repeated and produced by a structure larger than any human joint. Marsh had the unit in position, pairs on watch as the previous night. The perimeter was tight, 6 to 7 meters across, the bamboo stakes set in the outer ring. Crews had the radio. It was Briggs on the south side, paired with Thibault, Okafor and Alderman on the north. Marsh himself moving position to position, Doucet at the east point, alone, because Doucet had asked for the point position and Marsh had given it to him, and I think now that Marsh had put Doucet there as a kind of test of Doucet's nerve, or a gesture of professional respect for the man who had pushed back hardest. I was west, paired with Cruz, who had the radio between us on the ground. For the first 2 hours of that night, the clicking circled. Lower and faster than any previous night, the circuit now completing in perhaps 8 to 10 minutes, and the sound no longer had the quality of something moving between positions. It had the quality of something that had finished its assessment and was deciding. At approximately 2040, the clicking stopped. The silence was not the silence of the sound moving out of range. It was the silence of a held breath. The jungle sounds had gone completely. Not just the birds, which had been quiet since dark. Everything. The frogs along the drainage below us. The insects. The small mechanical sounds of the jungle at night that are so constant, you stop registering them until they are gone. They were gone. The silence was total, and it had weight, and every man on that perimeter felt it. And I know this because I could hear the breathing of the men nearest to me change from the slow, controlled breathing of watchful soldiers to the tight, shallow breathing of men who have concluded that something is happening. I raised my rifle. In the silence, I heard a sound from the south side of the perimeter that was not clicks and was not wind. It was the sound of the bamboo stakes in the outer ring moving. A light brushing sound, continuous, as if something was passing through them without breaking them, displacing them, and letting them fall back. It continued for perhaps 10 seconds and then stopped, and then there was no sound. And then there was a sound from the south side of the perimeter that I am going to describe to the record, and I ask that the record note that every man present can confirm it. It was the sound of feet on the ground, not the shuffling of undergrowth. Feet, a bipedal stride, slow, deliberate, on the bare earth inside the outer ring of stakes, inside the perimeter, not outside it. From Thibault's position, a hissed sound, the intake of breath through teeth. I turned. Marsh turned. I heard Alderman on the north side make a sound I cannot categorize and will not try to. In the south sector of the perimeter, in the darkness between Thibault's position and Briggs's position, something was standing. I had the flashlight I carried on operations, a right-angle military flashlight, and I turned it on. The light hit it at approximately 8 meters. I am going to tell you what I saw, and I am going to tell you only what I saw, and I am going to resist the impulse to reach for language that exceeds what my eyes gave me, because I believe that the attempt to be accurate is the only service I can provide to this record. It was standing upright. That is the first thing. After everything we had seen in the canopy, after 4 limbs and branch surfaces and the posture of a thing that had no relationship to the ground, it was standing on 2 legs in the south sector of our perimeter, and it was standing the way a man stands, not hunched, not crouched, upright, but it was not a man. It was not a man because a man does not have that shoulder width, and a man does not have arms that reach past the knee when standing, and a man does not have skin that color. Pale in the flashlight, yes, but pale in the daylight sighting had already established. In the flashlight, the color was closer to the color of something that has never seen the sun, the pale of a root or a fish from deep water, not white, something between white and the color of old bone. The face. I will not go into extensive description of the face because I do not trust my memory of it in the way that I trust my memory of the body proportions and the sequence of events, because the face is the part of the account my mind has been working over for 23 days, and I cannot be certain where memory ends and reconstruction begins. What I will say is this: the face was large and it was not featureless. It had the right structures in approximately the right arrangement, which was the same almost rightness as the molar, the same decision made almost correctly, and then going wrong at the precise moment that wrongness matters most. The eyes were open and reflecting the light, and they were oriented toward Thibaut, not toward me, with the flashlight, not toward Marsh, who had his rifle up, not toward the perimeter generally. Toward Thibaut specifically, and Thibaut was standing with his hand flat against his breast pocket. The thing stood in our perimeter for what I estimate was between 12 and 15 seconds. It did not move. It did not react to the flashlight. It did not react to Marsh's rifle at 8 feet. And I know this because Marsh told me later, when we were on the helicopter, that he had the rifle on it the entire time, and it never broke eye contact with Thibaut, never gave any indication that the weapon was a factor in its assessment of the situation. Marsh said, "It was not afraid of me," and he said it in a tone of voice I had never heard from him before, and that I hope, for his sake, he has since found a way to file somewhere useful. Doucet, from the East Point, said something in a low voice that I could not fully hear. I believe he said, "Give it back," but I cannot put that in the record as a confirmed quote because I did not hear it clearly enough. Thibaut unzipped his pocket. He held out the tooth. And here is where I have to be honest about something that is hard to be honest about, which is that what happened next is the center of everything that went wrong on the fourth night, and my part in it is not a passive part. I shouted at Thibaut not to. I did not plan to. It came out of me involuntarily, the shout of a man who has not decided what he wants, but who reacts to the motion rather than to the logic, and the sound of my voice in that silence was enormous. And the thing in the south sector of the perimeter turned its head, and in the same motion turned its body, and moved back through the bamboo stakes with that brushing sound, and was gone into the dark, and the clicking began immediately from the canopy overhead, shorter bursts now, faster, a different quality than it had had on any previous night, as if the patience of the previous night's circuits was over. Marsh did not hesitate. "Move," he said. "Now, rally at the creek crossing. Move." We moved. Everything that happened in the next 45 minutes happened fast and out of the frame of precise individual observation, and I will give you the sequence as accurately as I can. We broke the position in under 2 minutes. Marsh set the movement order. Doucet on point. Alderman and Okafor second. Briggs and Cruz in the middle with the radio. Marsh and Thibaut rearguard, and myself working the west flank to keep contact with the column. We were moving southwest toward the creek drainage, and then south toward the extraction point, and we moved at a speed that would have been reckless under normal patrol conditions, and that was the only option available under these conditions. The clicking was overhead for the first 20 minutes of the movement, moving with us, tracking the column, and I will be honest again about the specific quality of those 20 minutes. It was not the circling pattern of the previous nights. It was not the circuit that Doucet had interpreted as inventory. It was overhead and behind us, and it was keeping pace with the rear of the column, with Marsh and Thibaut, and it was getting closer to the canopy floor, with each 10 minutes of movement, the sound coming from lower branches, and then lower still. We were crossing the creek drainage, the same drainage where Doucet had stopped and looked up into the canopy on the first morning, and the sound was perhaps 10 meters above the rear of the column when the man behind Thibaut, which was Marsh, made a sound that I heard even from my position on the flank. A short, sharp sound, the sound of a man reacting to something touching him. I turned. The column kept moving, and I turned back and kept my position on the flank, and I want the record to understand that this was a decision, not an accident. I heard Marsh make that sound, and I chose to maintain my position and keep the column moving rather than go back, because stopping the column was the thing most likely to get more people killed, and I believe that assessment was correct, and it is the decision I will be managing for the rest of my life. Marsh reached the creek and crossed it, and when he came through the drainage, his sleeve was torn from the wrist to the elbow on his left arm, and the skin beneath was marked in a way that I am not going to attempt to describe in detail, because it is in the medical record, and Captain Hess has reviewed it. He was moving. He was functional. He did not say what had happened, and I did not ask in the moment. We ran. Not the disciplined, fast movement of a patrol under pressure. We ran. 7 men, and then, by the time we had cleared the drainage, 6 men, because it was in the drainage that the column had pulled apart, and what happened to the column pulling apart is the thing I need the record to carry most carefully. There was a man down. Private Briggs had gone down in the creek, and in the dark and the speed and the confusion of crossing, the column had fractured, and Doucet, who was on point, but who had looked back every 20 seconds of that entire movement, because Doucet had looked back for people his entire career as a point man, Doucet had seen Briggs go down. He should have kept running. That is what the training says, and that is what the tactical situation required. Every minute we stayed in that sector with the clicking still in the canopy above us was a minute closer to something else happening. Doucet turned back. I was perhaps 15 meters ahead of him when I realized he had turned. Marsh was ahead of me. I stopped. I looked back. In the darkness I could see Doucet, crouched at the creek bank over the shape of Briggs, and above them both in the canopy I could see nothing, but I could hear the clicking above them, lower than it had been all night, 6 or 7 meters above the ground, directly overhead, and it was slowing, not stopping, slowing to that circling inventory quality. Marsh had reached me by then. He put his hand on my arm and said, "Calloway." I knew what he was saying. I said, "We cannot leave them." He said it again, "Calloway." Just my name, just the one word. His hand on my arm and his voice with everything stripped out of it, except what the moment required. I called to Doucet. I said we had to move. Doucet did not look up. He had Briggs in his arms, and Briggs was moving, and Doucet said something back to me that I heard as, "Go ahead," meaning he would follow, meaning he would bring Briggs, meaning he had assessed the situation and made a choice. He was 22 years old, and he had assessed the situation and made a choice. Marsh pulled me, and I let him pull me, and we moved south, and we did not stop moving until we hit the extraction point clearing, at approximately 2300 hours, and the 5 of us who reached it lay down on the ground, or sat on the ground, and there was a period of minutes that I cannot account for in sequence, because I was not tracking time. Cruz raised the firebase on the radio. He reported the patrol breaking contact, incomplete extraction of unit personnel, requests for immediate pickup. The firebase confirmed the extraction helicopter would be at the clearing at 0400. It was then approximately 2310. We waited. The clicking was not at the extraction point. I want to be precise about this for the record. During the 4.5 hours we waited at the extraction clearing, I did not hear the clicking at the extraction site. I heard it once, briefly, at what I estimated as 200 meters to the north, the direction of the creek drainage, at approximately 0100 hours. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes, and then stopped. That is the last time I heard it. We waited for Doucet. I need the record to understand this. We waited for Doucet. We were at the extraction point for 4.5 hours, and for all of those hours, I was listening south along the trail we had come in on, listening for footsteps in the undergrowth, listening for Doucet's particular quiet movement through growth, listening for Briggs, who moved less quietly. I was listening for any sound from that direction that was human. I heard the clicking at 0100, moving away from us, to the north, back up toward the ridge, slow and quiet, and then gone. I heard no human sounds from the trail. The helicopter came at 0410. We boarded it. There were 5 of us on it. I am telling you now, for the record, that I shouted at Thibault when he held out the tooth, and that my shouting ended the only moment in 4 nights when the thing in the canopy had come to us voluntarily and was accepting an offer. I do not know with certainty that completing that exchange would have changed what happened in the creek drainage. I do not know that Doucet and Briggs would be sitting in this room today if I had stayed quiet, but I do not know that they would not be. And that uncertainty is the weight this deposition is asking me to put on the record. Thibault still has the tooth. He is attached to the 1st Brigade at Phu Bai, same as me, and he comes to breakfast in the morning and puts the tooth on the table beside his tray sometimes and looks at it. I have asked him once to consider submitting it to this deposition as physical evidence, and he agreed and has provided it to Captain Hess, who I am told has confirmed it has been logged as Exhibit 1 to this record. I want the record to note that I have looked at that tooth many times in the past 23 days, and it has not changed. The roots are still curved the way they are curved. The crown is still the shape it is. I have described it to the best of my ability, and whatever a formal scientific analysis of it determines, I will accept that determination as a data point. But I held that tooth in the field on March 12, 1972, and I have held it in my hands several times since, and I have had 11 months to learn what this country holds and does not hold, and I know what I know. I want the record to further note that in 4 nights of operation in Grid Sector Whiskey Tango 7, my unit observed the following: cessation of bird activity, consistent across multiple mornings. Fixed direct observation by a large primate-type animal at unusual altitude on the afternoon of the 2nd day. Circling vocalization in the upper and then lower canopy across 4 consecutive nights, exhibiting pattern behavior consistent with positional reconnaissance. Physical ground impressions at the base of a tree directly above an occupied fighting position. 2 canopy-level visual sightings of a large, pale, 4-limbed figure at speed. Incursion into a sealed perimeter by an upright figure which displayed no reaction to a flashlight or a weapon at close range, which oriented specifically to the individual carrying the object removed from the tunnel entrance, and which departed the perimeter when that moment of exchange was disrupted. I have told you what I know. I have told you the sequence. I have told you what I did and what it may have cost. Sergeant First Class Marsh will give his own deposition, and his account will be his own. I will note only that on the helicopter out, he sat with his arm across his knees and looked at the floor of the aircraft, and when I caught his eye once, he looked at me for a long time without saying anything, and then looked away. We have not discussed the operation since that morning, and I do not expect we will. The extraction clearing was behind us, inside of 2 minutes at helicopter speed. The ridge was behind us. The karst was behind us. The tunnel entrance, and whatever was beneath it, was behind us. And somewhere in the sector between the creek drainage and the ridgeline, if the deposition requires a formal accounting, are 2 men who went into Quang Tri province on my patrol and did not come out of it. I have been asked to provide any final statement I wish included in this record, beyond the formal testimony. My final statement is this. Marcus Doucet went back for Briggs without hesitating. He did not hesitate, and he did not calculate, and he did not leave a wounded man. That is the thing the record should know about him first, before anything else in his file, before Shreveport, before the 4 months in country, before whatever this record will do with him. He went back. He was 22 years old, and he went back without hesitating. I carry the reason he had to. The tooth is on the table in front of Captain Hess, in its evidence bag, and it is exactly as I described it. Whatever it is real. Whatever made it, it is still in those hills. I have nothing further to add to this deposition. I confirm that the above is my true and complete account, to the best of my knowledge, and I will sign it. Specialist 4th Class Raymond E. Calloway. 19 April 1972.